When we're planning a program or an evaluation of a program, we need to consider a number of very important ethical issues. And we start with the principle of doing no harm, particularly when we're involved in evaluating programs that are dealing with very vulnerable populations, such as those that are involved in the domestic and family violence reform. We need to consider the needs of those people from whom we'll be collecting information. These people have already been involved in traumatic situations, so our first port of call has to be creating no further trauma for them. They need to be able to be in an environment where they're protected and their safety is maintained, but also their comfort is there so that they're allowed to and encouraged to contribute in a very meaningful way to changes that can help other people, but in a way that doesn't compromise their safety or their personal well-being. It's a major principle of social justice that people are allowed to contribute meaningfully to both research and evaluation. They have to also be allowed to make that choice. So there may be some people who feel uncomfortable revisiting their experiences, or they may feel overpowered by the person with whom they're trying to discuss their experiences to allow evaluation to take place. We need to be very careful that there isn't a power dynamic that's operating, however covert or subtle that might be, so that people feel that unless they take part in the evaluation and the discussions, that they may be denied services that are important to their well-being. When we also engage with perpetrators, particularly in the field of domestic and family violence, it's important for those people to be heard because their story is part of the wider story, and their involvement is crucial because we need to understand how these programs affect them and their future well-being and their ability to go on and contribute meaningfully later on into society. So unless we hear from them, we're missing part of the story.
There are a couple of ethical considerations you need to think about when you're doing your evaluations. The first is that every individual needs to be respected and treated with dignity, even perpetrators. And always remember that the well-being of individuals is more important than the evaluation. The second ethical issue you need to consider is if you've got any vulnerable groups. These are participants that you want to make sure that aren't disadvantaged further. They may have limited capacity to make an informed decision. You may need to involve a person with legal responsibility, legal right to give consent. You need to think about whether they are coming from a socially or economic disadvantage, and things like using online surveys or that kind of thing may not work in those kind of communities because they may not have a stable internet connection. So you may need to think of hard copy or face-to-face interviews. You need to think of cultural issues. In Indigenous communities, you may need to get the elders involved and actually consult with them. And always remember that to get the voice of your participants in any research that you're doing.
So the first ethical consideration when we think about a new program to address something like domestic and family violence is that we do no harm. So the first consideration should always be when we introduce something else that we should not make the situation worse, particularly when we are dealing with a very vulnerable group of clients, as we are in the case of domestic and family violence. So that is the starting point. When it comes to the actual evaluation itself, there are a number of other ethical issues that we need to take into account. And these are all underwritten by the common principles that inform ethics in the social research that we do. And the two common principles are really around sort of no harm to participants, no harm to subjects, but that means more broadly no harm to stakeholders. But there are also important principles around informed consent, so that people understand that they are part of something that is an evaluation, that is a piece of research, that there is information that will be made available about them, that they will be consenting to, and people should have the opportunity to understand what information they're going to be required to provide, what the program will entail, and how the information will be used and who it will be used by. And they should have the opportunity to to opt in a non-coercive way, and they should have the opportunity to opt out. And the issues around coercion can be complex, because if we're talking, for instance, about a service provider who is providing some kind of a service to victims of domestic and family violence, there can sometimes be pressure on people to feel that they have to participate in a program, because if they don't, then the service provider may withdraw other things that they're potentially providing. So when we talk about informed consent, we're talking about genuine consent in the absence of coercion around those kinds of issues. We then have a whole set of other ethical concerns around how evaluators use the information that they get as a result of doing an evaluation. An evaluation at its heart is a piece of research, and as a piece of research we're collecting data, evidence, and that data relates to people. When we collect sensitive information about people, we have an obligation to only use it for purposes that they're comfortable with and that they understand and that they have consented to, and only to use it within the confines of the evaluation team, for instance, typically. So there's a set of ethical issues around the way in which we engage with stakeholders. There's a set of ethical issues around the way in which programs should be designed in the first place, and there's a set of ethical issues around the way in which people consent to participate and the information about them is used.